All right, thanks for everybody for allowing me to speak here today. A special thanks to Napa Tech. Looks like everyone has kind of said. I'll repeat that. I couldn't have had a better segue than the last speaker to kind of lead in to what I'm going to present today, because I'm probably going to take it up even a few levels higher and talk more specifically around how I think security operations and security organizations need to progress in order to meet up with the demands from a cybersecurity perspective. To hit the punchline first, I think full packet capture is probably the number one thing that people need to be investing in right now for not only a lot of the challenges that the other presenters mentioned, but for some of the things that I'm going to talk about that I really see as some core issues with how security operations are organized today, but then have a lot of recommendations too, and where I think the thought process needs to go. So I did want to, so there's a couple things. One, I took into account that I'm last, so I understand that. And so I want it to be more of a conversation, right? So it's not, I don't have a ton of slides. Matter of fact, half of them are pictures. And it's really just to kind of keep me on track and generate thought process. And hopefully, for those going to dinner, we can continue the conversation there. And some of the things I'm going to talk about today, because I really hope that the message that I'm delivering resonates much farther beyond this particular room today. But then also things that you can take back to your organizations and having these discussions. So one of the things I need to kind of do, I think, we've been talking about full packet capture, right? We've been talking about building context around what originally in security operations are small snippets of code that identify a possible suspect network traffic. So I got to build context around who's sitting in front of you today as well. As much as I don't like talking about myself, I think it builds good context around why you're getting the message that you're getting from me. This is probably the number one thing of where I see conversations. And so to let you know the role that I have at Dell EMC, I'm a business development manager and I support federal agencies, civilian agencies. And so I handle probably one of the kind of the larger agencies throughout that space. And so we're leading discussions in how people need to prepare from the Dell EMC perspective, how they need to prepare in their IT modernization goals and things like that. When you have traditional cybersecurity discussions around that, or really any topic, what we hear from the C-suite there is that they're just very technical discussions, right? They're not contextual to how they look at their business. And again, the last speaker talking about understanding what your business is today, what it does from an operational perspective, being able to include those metrics alongside some of these security risks, that is the future. That is where we need to be able to go. But it's a really, really tough problem to tackle as you're all invested in trying to figure out as well. So I think it's obvious to say that we're not keeping up. We do our best, but we find out at some point down the road, that we didn't catch something. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about as far as the skill sets that I think that we need to evolve to. A lot of technical folks in the room, understanding the technical issues, but what does that look like from the other skill sets that need to be within our security organizations to carry on some of the messaging, and quite honestly, to get the investments and the justifications around investing more in security. Again, from my past federal experience prior to coming to Dell, I've been at Dell for 2 years. Prior to that, I worked at Social Security Administration, and I was the director of technical operations there, managing SOC and a lot of the other technical, like pen test teams and things. And it was my job to make sure that I had the right folks in the room that could analyze threats, but also start thinking about the future and how we need to invest in different things in order to be able to detect the threat of the future, whatever that is, right? So I want to kind of go back a couple steps, but I will throw in the caveat here that a lot of my references and things like that are federal in perspective, because that's the environment I came from. So the numbers tend to be bigger, as far as the amount of money that we had to invest in security and things like that. SSA had a $1.7 billion IT budget annually. We probably spent 60 million of that on security. However, 80% of that, as folks that follow in the federal space know, 80% of that was just on maintenance costs of all of these security products. And so, yes, $60 million, but 12 million for actual new things that you need to invest in an enterprise that has 300 nodes on the network, right? And across 1,500 offices and in every embassy around the world. So the skill sets that I brought to the table at that time, and I think a lot of folks here probably have similar experiences. So in 1993, I was a few years out of high school, and that's also when the Pentium 1 was released, by the way. I looked that up, right? So I bought my first PC. It wasn't the first PC that I had, but it was the one that I spent $2,500 on for a Pentium 1, right? And back then, the internet didn't work it just didn't work. You tried to go to the internet and DNS didn't resolve and you ran into all these issues. And so what you had to do is you had to figure it out and you had to troubleshoot. You had to understand how it worked. Well, that benefited a great deal from a cybersecurity perspective many, many years later because I knew how these things work. And so you can protect the different hops and all these different things. It gave a skill set that other folks didn't have. And certainly folks coming out of college today typically don't have when they graduate from cybersecurity programs and they know how to use a tool, read the report, and hope for the best, right? And so the skill sets that we hire into now, I was hiring folks that didn't even have cybersecurity degrees. I hired a sociology major because he made the reports look pretty, and from a human consumption perspective, they didn't like red, so we used pastel colors. I mean, a dumb example, but you get my drift there. And so anyway, to kind of progress through this timeline, as we get a little bit further, 2000 just happens to be the year that I started at SSA, and one of the things that catapulted my security career quickly were things like I Love You. For everyone that remembers, the key fact here, though, is it was one of the first viruses that ever came out that reached 1 million machines very, very rapidly. And so that's what really started to put some thought process in, we really need to invest in cybersecurity because we can't have these things impact us. But at that point, those discussions were certainly not about losses. They were more about productivity. We can't have 1 million employees or several iterations for some folks, looking at these things and wasting time and downloading viruses to their machine. It was just a lot of nuisance work, right? And so I think a lot of folks have made careers out of combating that nuisance work. But things started getting really interesting. Short time into my career in the government, the magical VA laptop that was stolen. So someone left a laptop in their car and it got stolen. So that led to congressional mandates that everything had to be encrypted, everything. And from, you had security professionals that were just encrypt. That's my answer. What should we do about this? Encrypt it. The rest of us, and I assume a lot of people in this room from an analyst perspective, right? That was a nightmare. All of a sudden, everyone's talking about encrypting this to this. Well, great. What does that mean to me? Now I can't see anything, right? My IDS is dark now. I can't see a thing. And so all of a sudden you had the business owners starting to inject themselves into the conversation and quite honestly winning, because they're starting to say, we actually don't want to encrypt from here to here. Great for me, now I can see everything, but they wanted to be able to inspect that traffic, right? And so now all of a sudden we had things that we were told we had to do from a security compliance perspective, and we had this whole other perspective of things that, we don't want this security measure to go in place. The reason and kind of one of the things that I think full packet capture ends up lending to us is that visibility for these losses. That loss cost the VA ultimately several years later $20 million in restitution just for losing one laptop. It cost them $20 million. If that was a small company and then the same type of thing happened, that company would be out of business, Just because it was the VA, it was different. However, as you start to climb up into more recent times, I have like 4 different credit monitoring, for free now, being a federal employee. OPM lost 21.5 million identities. Coincidentally enough, for all the folks that had clearances and things like that, those were the databases that were compromised in that. Again, from a cost perspective, that just in credit monitoring cost them over $300 million. And people, that's just looking up the contracts that they pay for credit monitoring. I think the one thing that they really wish they would have been able to do is to prove the exact amount of things that were lost, as opposed to ultimately was just an estimation. And a business risk, a business decision that said, we just need to do this. We need to pay for credit monitoring for all these folks. Again, large company now, if they just lost $350 million for one breach, out of business, right? They actually say that the true costs of that now are over $1 billion, right, for one loss. And that doesn't even compare to what just happened, right? Doesn't even compare. So Equifax, 143 million identities, totally different stories depending on what you hear. Equifax is saying, oh, it's just the high-level information. Other folks are saying, no, it's actually all of that activity logs that go into credit reports is gone. All right, and that'll be court battles that'll take years, and who knows how much we'll actually end up paying for something like that. But we know, and we think anyway, that machine learning, artificial intelligence, all these things are going to be the answer here. Yet to prove itself, but we absolutely know going to be valuable. So from a security organization perspective, where a bulk of the security organization now sits is they know that the key to all of this is knowing what all your assets are, standardizing as much as possible so you can start to predict the risks over in these certain areas. Development labs obviously going to have a lot more risk than 1,000 laptops that are deployed to this group with all this exact same image on it, and know who has access to it. And we spend tons and tons and tons of money collectively on niche products for all of these problems that have happened through the years that we all still have, because you never get rid of one. And you just build on for every new problem that's come out, and we're still stuck in the, do you even know what you have on your network? And can we standardize? Why are these people not using our standard image? And who has access to this information? And it's still all unbeknownst to us. We don't know. Meanwhile, during this entire timeline, we've been teetering back and forth as far as what our core initiative is, right? So do we respond faster? Do we work and spend resources on having the ability to respond faster? Or do we work more on all of our capabilities to patch quickly and identify vulnerabilities and things like that? And then all of that being thrown up in the air again because we actually know that most of these compromises now are with legitimate credentials. All right, so now what do? Now it's actually legitimate users coming in a legitimate way, we think, from our perspective. And then how do we even know if that's the right person that's accessing it? We know they have access to it, so everything looks cool, right? So a big problem, right? And that's where we are. Just encrypt. I still think we're into the mentality of encrypt everything wherever possible. Where, and kind of one of the thought processes as far as like how we need to start changing some of the conversations though, and which then affects us from an organizational perspective, is that many organizations still don't even have a key management policy. Because how we've actually deployed encryption is just full disk encryption, or encrypt these data files, and then make sure someone at a help desk has a key that can open up all these things in case we can't get into it for some reason, that employee leaves all of a sudden. But they're very general. It's a very general, all-encompassing encryption methodology. But we know that with a lot of going forward, encryption is still going to be used. There's still going to be the folks that have to manage these things and answer these questions. But encryption will be used in much more innovative ways, right? Because it'll be the keys that will actually control digital rights management in some of these projects now, right? Where we can actually control who has access to what document on the fly and change that access on the fly, and can put different policies on it when they leave the perimeter, And now all of a sudden we can start detecting these things. And more importantly, bring things into more of a granularity. And when we want, key revocation, bam, that's it. No one has access to those files anymore, right? These are the things that we're learning from cloud implementations, right? That's exactly how AWS manages their cloud. They encrypt everything. They don't actually get rid of your data or anything like that. They destroy the key. Boom, move on, let it overwrite. Right? So that's how we're going to be using encryption going forward. Well, what does that mean to a security organization? We have to figure out how we're going to manage that policy, right? Who has access to those things? How are we going to deploy this new methodology? Right? These are more strategists than technicians, right? Because now we have to talk to every single one of those business stakeholders to understand how it's going to impact them, how their policy might be a little bit different in this group than in this group over here, right? And who's going to oversee that? Right, so these are some of the things that I think need to start happening. Kind of was alluded to in the last presentation. We have a lot of traditional ways of detecting things, but we need to be much tighter aligned with the business units that are operating, in essence, the core mission of whatever your organization is. Right? We have to understand specifically what user behavior looks like in all of these unique cases that you might be managing within your portfolio. In my entire career as a cybersecurity professional, I didn't care about any of that. I didn't know anyone's name. I didn't know who was in charge of that application. All I know is that it was an IP address that triggered this alert, and you need to shut this down or apply this patch or whatever direction, and then I'm off to something else, some anonymous activity that I need to go find and tell this person to do this. Right? We need to have a much more of a communication methodology with these folks now, right? We have to understand the business. We have to understand the portfolio. We have to understand what normal is. What I think that we need to lead with, though, is now all of a sudden we are joint owners of this. Right? I think this will change security organizations considerably, because now if you are going to start tracking all of this information that not only is valuable to me as a security professional, but incredibly valuable to an application owner. You would think, you would hope, that they're already doing these types of things, right? They're already building models based off of user testing. What does a user look like when they come to my application? We need to understand that, because that is the model that we're going to use to detect anomalies. Very specific to your business, not general COTS product. Hopefully it'll do what we want it to do like it did for this other customer, right? That's a lot of work that has to be done, that likely that skill set of folks that would go through and start having those conversations, those skill sets may not exist within your security organizations today. Those are the types of folks that actually need to be hired into your organization to balance out the skill set so that they can start having these types of conversations, right? So that information, too, again, becomes a joint conversation, because now it is, well, if I'm going to start collecting this information, who is actually going to put that infrastructure in place? If you're going to have data analytics, full packet capture maybe even, right? If I'm going to put that around my application stack, and it might be an on-prem cloud stack or even something in AWS, right? If I can look at all of this traffic and start to normalize what normal is and detect of what is not, now all of a sudden I don't want to just have a security person look at that information, and if it's not a security risk, throw it away. Why not take that same information and say, hey, this navigation pattern went a little bit odd. I thought it might have been a security risk because they jumped right from the login page right to my change submit form, to change their address in my database or something like that. And it's odd because normally when they log in, they have these big buttons that they click on, and it's a couple hops, but they went right there. Well, there could be legitimate reasons that they were able to do that. They had the page stored, et cetera, whatever. But if you don't know that as an application owner, what that path is, that's something that might be interesting from that perspective. And so I think that we're going to start moving more into the direction where we have to decide not what the infrastructure that supports our application is, and then the infrastructure that supports our security analytics around this, how we're actually going to be able to deploy a shared environment and share the analytics off of it, but from totally different perspectives, right? If you had a full packet capture stack, for example, But then you had tools that would rerun this packet capture for this perspective, from a business perspective, and then maybe likely as well from a different security perspective or something like that. That obviously saves a tremendous amount of investment when we're sharing that type of infrastructure. So I think things start to look a little bit more like this, right? And as we're sitting here talking about this too in a very static environment, of course the environments are changing all the time too. You know, now we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of sensors that are deployed everywhere. Well, you know what? On the reverse, maybe the security folks want to start deploying sensors. I actually don't have a lot of insight into your application. And I know you might not find this sensor relative, but I actually want to put a sensor in your environment so that I can get this type of information. And then start having that commingled, shared type of conversations of where you can both benefit and ultimately, from a high level, a joint investment, right? And the data center folks always get tons more money than the security folks get anyway. But I think that we also need to be, you know, every time you walk across the street, someone's throwing out the word agile. So I think security organizations need to be more agile as well. I've seen, and maybe I'm tainted again coming from a government organization, but I've seen policy recommendations take more than a year to ever actually be in policy to where a security person can point and say, that's why we're calling you today, is because of this, right? I think we need to lead with policy much more proactively. And the way to do that is by allowing exceptions. You know, we are just not in a 100% world. This is going to solve this problem. This is going to solve this problem. And we can't take a year to decide how a policy doesn't impact our entire enterprise. And that's typically why those conversations take that long. It's, we would like to say do this, but then everyone kicked back from that. And so now we have to tweak it. Well, that doesn't sound like good security at all anyway, all right? We're already compromising. I don't think we're in a position to have to compromise anymore, right? When a business owner can lose $350 million from one breach, we have quantifiable data now that we never did before. There's so many breaches out there, we can actually have quantifiable discussions and say, I can actually tell you right now, we're going to lose $350 million on one breach. You know, those types of conversations are very compelling to leaders. So, but I also think, and this is where a lot of the work comes into, is that we need folks that can manage a data governance type program throughout the enterprise. As we know, data is going to be the core of everything, because all of these infrastructures are collapsing, right? Everything's hyper-converged and things, so all of these things are coming into more dense compute, storage. And so it's all about the data. We need to know where the data is going, who's accessing it, where it's flowing, all of these things. And if we have insight into that, because we're managing a data governance program, those are very contextual things that we can take to the individual stakeholders and say, what is this? I don't know what it is, but from a technical perspective, I can see data going here, here, and then it leaves over here. What is that? And they can start to say, oh, well, that's because our application does this, this, and this. All right? Those are the actual conversations that need to be occurring now. Again, not easy ones to have, but I can spout them off at a podium right here and say, you know, we need to go do this, right? There. Picture. Know. Just know. Visibility. Get insight. Start to figure this stuff out. Document it, right? These are the conversations that we need to be having. As far as like the best implementation I ever had that kind of suits into this, right? A lot of challenges talked about today as far as like having those conversations with folks and making change across an organization based on security threats or suspected threats. We implemented a data loss prevention program, infrastructure that had endpoint components, but more importantly had a gateway component associated with it. As a back end to that DLP implementation, there was full packet capture. So had about 2 terabytes worth of storage on the infrastructure. For the first time, we were able to lead security conversations with very visible data. Not, hey, let's try to find this packet and how it relates to this issue, and it's a bunch of other technicians that manage the network and client server groups and things like that. We were going to stakeholders because we were able to take all of the packets associated with a single session, throw it through an engine that rendered it, and I had a Word document in my hand. I didn't have a security alert. I had a Word document that said this was sent out via an email, and this has 20 people's SSNs and names and things like that in it. And they were just like, wow, I mean, that just doesn't happen. We tell all of our employees, don't send out PII. It's like, well, there's 14,000 more of these that I can show you. You know, I mean, this is happening. What is the business process? A lot of those conversations, you know, yes, ended up with personnel sanctions and all kinds of fun stuff that the government does to its own employees. But it also took application owners and said, well, we can actually change this. There's no reason this information needs to be on these notices. That's kind of for inside. You know, those are just for us to be able to relate it to a claim or some other type of file. The note that goes out in this Word document doesn't need that information. Boom, minor change to an application, gone. Well, again, thinking from the traditional security operations standpoint, tons of noise went away. Tons of noise. This is how all of a sudden we're not only storing less and things like that, but these things just aren't even coming up anymore. Another thing that happened in the DLP, just again as an example here, so SSA, so a little bit specific, but SSA started accepting Spanish speaking. So they had a whole claims process for people that natively spoke Spanish. So it had a whole different application, all different parts of processes and things like that. So a lot of folks would go to Microsoft Word, and then they would go out and say, translate this for me, so they could send it to a Spanish-speaking person. Very, very customer-friendly. All of a sudden, we're getting DLP alerts out the wazoo from all across the organization. Again, a technical perspective. The end user has no idea this even happens. We were able to show them, educate them, totally change their culture and the way that they process things, because we were able to show them that when Microsoft Word hits translation, that call to translate is actually going out to their cloud. And it was taking personal information and shoving it out in the cloud, clear text, and our sensors were able to pick it up. Minor change in group policy actually said, well, we can say every time that Microsoft Word closes, reset it to no translation services. So that way someone would actually need to go choose it again, because they probably only needed it once in months. I kid you not, millions of alerts gone, all gone from one group policy change, right? Those are the types of things that come from having real life discussions with folks, but in a way where we're doing it from their perspective. No one likes to talk to stakeholders because they have no idea what you do for a living, right? They have no idea how to analyze these things. But having a conversation like that, incredibly powerful. That's what's driving some of my conversation today. I think some of the good news is this. First couple slides, right? Knowing what your assets are, things like that. The other hard part from a security organization, I think, is to know how we need to change and what rate we need to prepare for that change. You need to be more closely aligned with your organization's IT modernization policy. What does their roadmap look like for deploying certain things into the cloud or using converged stacks on-prem? We just have to be in the conversations from the beginning. We can't still be stuck in the mentality of data center's going to do what the data center's going to do. We have to live with it. So we have to be able to show them statistical information on how this impacts us. But be rest assured, this is a problem that you're going to have. Everything is going to converge, right? The good news is the process changes. All of these assets, these virtual machines, these virtual instances in here are identical. So do we need to do vulnerability scans against all of these virtual instances? We know exactly how it was configured. We approved, as a security organization, we approved that configuration. So another little aside here, I wrote a kind of thought-provoking white paper, was it in the government? Did not go over well. mainly because it had the word easy in there. The rest of the title was Enterprise Architecture Makes Security Easy. No one liked it, mainly because we really weren't using enterprise architecture was a paper exercise. This is how we do everything. And then the truth of, which we all see on a daily basis, that's not how everything is deployed. Right? There's so many one-offs. Start enforcing it. Get the power to enforce it. Get the power to change some of these things, force those stakeholders to have to re-architect something to match to your enterprise architecture plans, because you have to start preparing that way, right? You have to start trusting the way that these things are deployed. That's number one word not to include in your vocabulary as a security professional. But you have to start trusting that if I can know for sure that this is the gold image and that this is a uniform environment, I'm good. For that environment, you're still going to have a whole bunch of traditional stuff over here, right? But at least for that, all of a sudden now, licensing costs are reduced for how many IPs you need to scan, all those types of things. And the whole point is being able to free up money, not net new money now, just free up money that you're already spending on maintenance to be able to turn that into all of the great things that you've seen today that you want to buy and don't have money for, right? So in doing all of this work, and again, this isn't really relative to what I'm saying other than to show it pictorially, we have to start thinking about delivering these as a service. SOA is so 10 years ago, yeah, I get it. But this is actually what's happening now. I mean, this is the way that we have to have our service, our security capabilities, something that can be triggered on the fly. Again, the encryption services and things like that. This is not just, go encrypt everything and then don't worry about it. These things, from a business operations standpoint, even from a security visibility standpoint, we need to be able to encrypt these on the fly. As it's leaving the perimeter, throw a DRM, digital rights management wrapper on it as it goes out. You might not even, it might have access for everyone to be able to read, but guess what you can do now? Now you can watch all your documents even though they're outside of your perimeter. This is the type of visibility that you need. Right? Because you remember you needed to see where all your data was going. These are things that are going to help in those conversations in the future. But I think we also need to leverage all of these other things that are sometimes siloed security, right? I mean, how many folks sit and actually, are an analyst, every day, and that same person that's sitting in the next cube over does disaster recovery? It's usually an entirely different group of folks that are doing DR. But in these types of environments, these collapsed, converged environments, they can be one of the same, right? The DR is going to help from it's actually a security capability. I have this data stored that I can actually restore. And it's not like I'm pulling it out in the government standpoint, I'm pulling out tapes from a mountain and trying to restore them, or my backup time takes so much in my non-production window, it takes so much time that I don't actually get to test to see if it's recoverable. I just hope that if I need to recover it for some reason, it'll work. I found out many times through experience that it doesn't. It just doesn't sometimes. Something got corrupted, the backup got corrupted, oh my God, you know what I mean? Now what do we do? So these things now test on the fly. You know what I mean? There's products out there that are taking backups, putting them in a secure on-prem cloud, taking virtual machines, testing their recoverability, and snapshotting that every hour. We're not doing it every night in a batch or anything like that. We're doing it every hour and testing the recoverability of that. Well, if you know and trust and are able to validate that that is a certain process, you can make totally different decisions in how you're managing risk in other parts of your environment. Not to mention, ransomware becomes not an issue, right? So those are some of the things I think that we need to think about. I mean, continuous availability, all of these other things. All the other parts of the business, that's exactly how they're thinking of things, is just service enablement for whatever they need to do. That's the work that they're going to be doing from a data center modernization perspective, is starting looking at redundant types of applications, redundant code, making them a class, have them be able to call. Those are the types of things that they're working on from a modernization perspective. all the security professionals need to be sitting right next to those folks saying, well, don't forget this is the part that I need. And by the way, what I'm going to provide your application are these service capabilities here. Right? All things that end up being involved in an application lifecycle. Right? So there's a lot of other examples that I'm sure that you can start to think of what other things exist in your environment that you might be able to leverage. Purely based on cost, does it make sense for you to have a replica storage environment to where you're pulling all of this data in? I mean, that's just where we are. I mean, everyone gets it, right? You're pulling all the copies of these net flows over here, and I'm going to put them in Splunk, and I'm going to analyze them separately from the network engineers, right? What if you actually are able to think about how you want to process them? And I think what was brought up at least 6 times today was, I don't need to store everything. Let me process them, and I know that those things are relevant that I can just process and store. And then actually, you know what, I might just go ahead and tell the network engineers, I don't need sampling. I need you to store everything. But you need to process them too after the fact, after I'm able to see it and process it on my side. Then you can get rid of it, rather than buying your own storage so you can do that. Right? Again, those are the types of things I think are going to maximize investments across the board. But also, I think that if you don't feel it yet, you need to start feeling it, is that security folks need to start driving these enterprise architecture decisions. They need to start driving it for the enablement that they want, that you want. VDI, something that pops up in a ton of conversations. How would it change? And then these are discussions. These are things like this forum or internal to the organization that you just need to sit around a table and poke at these, right? VDI is something that, hey, you know what? I'm tired of managing 100,000 endpoints that are all uniquely different. Most of the people have admin privileges anyway because I needed to add Chrome for this one thing or what have you, right? So rather than having to talk about, well, I mean, you still have to talk about software catalogs and all that kind of stuff, much harder to deploy with all of these endpoints that you're managing separately. One of the big things, again, from a technology standpoint, desktop as a service, laptops as a service. I mean, these are the things that big agencies are wanting to have. I don't want to own my laptops anymore. You're going to be giving up significant control as a security person if you're not even managing those laptops anymore. Somebody else is, right? Well, I would want those clients to be a little bit dumber and maybe not even able to print, what have you, right? And connect into a VDI. The beauty of VDI from that standpoint, from a security standpoint, and again, why it should be a driver, because the business has probably been teetering on it for 10 years because somebody needed Photoshop, and so that's why they made an enterprise-wide decision that VDI wasn't a good job. 10 years later, of course, all those problems have been resolved. But if you're able to drive that discussion, now you have full visibility into that stack. It's a centralized stack. You're providing virtual desktops to your entire enterprise, and guess what? All those assets are identical, but then stored separately. The differentiators. These folks need access to these applications. They don't. All of a sudden, now you're not buying applications for all of your enterprise users that they don't need it. Everybody's got a copy of Visio, and they open it up one time a year, right? So it's those types of things. Again, licensing costs, savings, and be able to move some of that money into security investment. For one, I'm tired of telling people, store all your documents in SharePoint. You know, if they're sensitive documents, store them in some central place. They never store them in a central place. Or there's 500 copies of the exact same document because everybody does it. Or it's an email. You can start driving those discussions by doing analytics on that stack, right? Because now everything's in VDI. I can run data deduplication process there and find out exactly how many copies of a document are. And again, take those statistical types of information and go talk to those stakeholders and ask them, how would this be different if we offered you this capability? And then drive the architecture decisions that you need to have for further enablement. That's what I have here is the security DNA, right? It's a wish place. And so the only point of this slide is to say that all of these stakeholders are having conversations like this. They're going out and trying to understand who's using their application, why they're using their application, what's our marketing plans, how do we do this, right? Security folks need to be in every single one of those conversations, every single one, because all of them impact what you're going to be implementing in the future. As people are moving workloads to clouds today, you're going to be stuck in having to manage two different environments. Right? If you're not already thinking about, or using as criteria in your decision making for what product you choose that will support both cloud, external, internal, and things that are residing on traditional systems, you're going to end up with a multitude of products, right? Products that, as the example I gave earlier, that you're going to be paying maintenance for, and things like that that you might not even need. The best thing I ever did when I was creating, so my first 10 years was in the data center. My last 5 years there was working directly for the CISO as the Director of Technical Operations. I didn't hire a bunch of cyber people. I brought an SCCM specialist, a network engineer that was interested in doing security stuff, and in network engineering was the person that was doing NetFlow anomalies and trying to predict viruses and things like that. That SCCM specialist did more work in detecting things that were undetectable than any other person that was on our vulnerability scanning team. And again, not to throw out, I'm not going to say don't go out and get rid of your vulnerability scanner. I'm not saying that. First of all, we ended up with 3 because there's research development labs behind all of those people that make vulnerability scanners. This one detects some things that this one doesn't, this one detects, and you need them all. What the SCCM specialist did is they could show this patch didn't make it to that system anyway. Do I need a separate system to scan in when I can already Google what vulnerabilities come with that patch missing? What was most valuable was to have a pen testing team because of the 3 million alerts, which are 3 million vulnerabilities that we had, which sounds like a really big number, but when you start taking it and dividing it by 300 assets, it's really 10 things that are missing. And those 10 things might actually just be 2 patches that have 5 individual vulnerabilities missing. We were able to exploit a couple thousand things maybe, actually exploit it. So don't go off patching these 3 million things go patch these first. These are exploitable and I can prove it, right? So that's a totally different business process there. But again, the SCCM specialist, when the vulnerability scanner said, hey, this is missing here, we didn't have access to patch it anyway. That was the reason the vulnerability still existed, because SCCM didn't have access to the box to patch it to begin with. She detected Zeus before anybody. All she did was run hash files on everything in SCCM that had changed in file size in the past 24 hours. Again, just anomaly detection against a known infrastructure, and she was able to go detect all of that much faster than someone could do an enterprise-wide scan, right, to try to detect these things. And I mean, we didn't even know it was in the environment anyway, right? So these are some of the thoughts that need to go on. I'm not going to keep throwing out a ton of examples, but this is how I think the mentality needs to change. I could give everybody a hug and say this is our time, but it really is. I mean, we need to drive. If there's any stakeholder, if there's any CEO, anyone that says, why is a security person in the room? They won't be a CEO for long anyway. You can outlive those folks. So anyway, on that fantastic note, thank you all for your time. And I mean, if there's any questions or any comments or anything like that, I can take those too. Or we can just go enjoy our break at the end of the day. So thank you all again, seriously.